Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the annexation of Hawaii. We're going to go through this brief slideshow and I'm going to explain a few things to you. Feel free to jot down any information or revisit this recording. Oh, went too far. Let me go back. Okay. The group of islands that we now call Hawaii are quite remote. They are located in the Pacific Ocean, over 2,000 miles from the next closest land. Historians disagree about when the first humans reached Hawaii, but it could have been as early as 200 CE that the first Polynesians from other islands in the Pacific reached the Hawaiian Islands. Over hundreds of years, more people arrived from islands in the Pacific, probably including Tahiti and Bora Bora. Over time, societies developed across the islands. Each island was ruled by at least one chief, or ali'i, and societies were hierarchical. I always have a hard time saying that. Hierarchical, with a system of rules regulating conduct. Many Hawaiian commoners were farmers who built stone aqueducts to irrigate their farms or tended fish ponds that were built near the ocean to raise and stockpile fish. British arrival. In 1778, British explorer James Cook arrived in Hawaii with two ships. The Hawaiians welcomed and celebrated Cook, but he was killed by Hawaiians in 1779, about a year later, in a dispute over a stolen boat. Crew members killed Hawaiians and burned homes in retaliation before sailing away and returning to England. Still, the British visit changed Hawaii in more ways than one. The British brought diseases that would kill large numbers of Hawaiians as well as modern weapons. They also spread word about the islands. After these initial visits from Cook, more foreigners began to arrive at the islands. Missionaries, especially from the United States, first arrived in 1819. They aggressively worked to convert Hawaiians to Christianity. Unification. In 1782, just a few years after the arrival and death of Captain Hook, the ali'i nui, the high chief, of the island of Hawaii, also known as the Big Island, Kamehameha, began a series of wars with neighboring ali'i to take control of their land. His troops had an advantage over many others because they used modern weaponry. By 1795, Kamehameha had won control over almost all the Hawaiian Islands and declared the establishment of the Kingdom of Hawaii. By 1810, all of the islands had joined. Reforms to government. Kamehameha III, a son of Kamehameha I, took power in 1819. He sent delegations to the United States and European countries to pressure them to recognize Hawaii as a sovereign, independent country, which they did. Starting in 1840, he led a series of reforms to the structure of government and land ownership in Hawaii. This included a policy establishing private land ownership in 1840 and a law that allowed foreign citizens to own land for the first time. That was passed in 1850. With this change in law, white planters, many the descendants of missionaries, bought massive amounts of farmland, often for very little money, to use for sugarcane production. Within a few decades, a small group of white American European planters controlled 4/5 of the arable, which is the usable to grow crops, land in Hawaii. Bayonet Constitution. A group of mostly American businessmen living in Hawaii formed the Hawaiian League, also known as the Annexation Club, to push for American annexation of Hawaii. In 1887, they led an uprising against King Kalakaua. They threatened violence and forced him to sign a new constitution that greatly reduced his powers. This was referred to as the Bayonet Constitution, since he agreed under massive pressure. The new constitution transferred almost all power to members of the Hawaiian League, who made themselves government officials. I'm going to give you a timeline after this, but I'm going to discuss it a little bit right now. King Kalakaua died in 1890, and his sister, Liliuokalani, became queen. Although she fought to return power to the monarchy and to native Hawaiians by 1898, Hawaii had been annexed by the United States. Read the timeline to learn more about what happened over the course of those 10 years, and you'll have that in just a few minutes. and the question we're going to be talking about. We're going to focus on the question of whether Hawaiians supported the annexation. We're going to do that by looking at Hawaiian newspapers from around the time of the annexation. These might give us a sense of how people in Hawaii were feeling about annexation. So with that, we'll move on to the timeline.